Government of India Act 1909 Political Science. Analysis of the Government of India Act of 1909 Morley-Minto reforms, complete with integrated academic sources tailored for a college level political science examination. The Government of India Act 1909 Morley-Minto reforms, the institutionalization of communal politics and the reframing of constitutional agitation. The Government of India Act of 1909, popularly known as Morley-Minto reforms, represent a critical and deeply consequential pivot in the constitutional history of British India. From a political science perspective, it was a classical colonial maneuver. It offered a measured expansion of legislative participation to co-opt the uh, moderate wing of the Indian National Congress while simultaneously introducing a divisive constitutional mechanism, separate electorates that would permanently alter the landscape of Indian politics. The act was not a step towards democracy but a sophisticated strategy of managed dissent and divide and rule, which successfully sowed the seeds of communal representation that would eventually lead to partition. The political and ideological context, the precondition for reform. The radicalization of nationalism post 1905, the partition of Bengal 1905, and the subsequent Swadeshi and boycott movement marked the decline of the moderate era and the rise of extremists. The movement, mass base, assertive methods, and demand for Swaraj demonstrated that the politics of prayer and petition were no longer sufficient to manage Indian dissent. The British government, alarmed by this radical turn, sought to strengthen the hands of the loyal moderates like Gopal Krishna Gokhale by offering constitutional concession, hoping to draw them back into the collaborative fold and isolate the extremists. The strategic demand for Muslim safeguards. The British policy of divide and rule found a receptive audience among a section of the Muslim elite who were concerned about their future in a potential Hindu majority India dominated by the Congress. The similar deputation of 1906, a group of elite Muslims led by the Aga Khan, formally presented Viceroy Lord Minto with a demand for separate political identity, including separate electorates and weighted representation in any legislative bodies. This provided the British with the perfect political justification to implement a divisive policy under the disguise of protecting minority rights. C. The official dialogue, Morley and Minto. John Morley, the Secretary of State of India, was a liberal who believed in the gradual association of Indians with the administration. However, his liberalism was sharply constrained by Viceroy Lord Minto's conservative realism and the overarching imperative of preserving British control. The correspondence reveals the central tension of the reforms, the conflict between the rhetoric of political liberalization and the reality of imperial consolidation. Source integration. The dynamics of the similar deputation and the British strategy are detailed in Stanley Wolpert's A New History of India and M.N. Das India's under Morley and Minto. The nationalist context is provided in Sumit Sarkar's The Swadeshi Movement in Bengal, 1903 to 1908. Key provisions of the Act, a mechanism of controlled representation. The Act introduced several significant changes to the structure and function of legislative councils. The significant expansion of the size and functions of legislative councils. Central Legislative Council. The number of members was increased from 16 to 60. The official majority was maintained, but it was now a narrower one. Provincial legislative councils, their sizes were substantially enlarged for the first time. Non-official majorities were introduced in the provinces, that is Bengal, Bombay, Madras. Though these were not elected majorities, and the governor's veto power remained absolute. Enhanced functions, members were granted the right to move resolutions on the budget and on matters of general public interest, ask supplementary questions, making interpellation a more potent tool, discuss matters of public interest and vote on separate items of the budget, though the Viceroy Governor could restore any grant refused by the Council. Political science analysis. This created a more vibrant, if still powerless, legislative arena. It allowed Indian members to engage in more substantive criticism of government policy, turning the councils into a training ground for parliamentary practice and a platform for Indian nationalist propaganda. The introduction of an elective principle, though not full election, the Act introduced for the first time the principle of election to the legislative councils, moving beyond the system of nomination and recommendation of the 1892 Act. However, the franchise were extremely limited, based on high property tax and educational qualifications. The electoral bodies were often themselves narrow and unrepresentative, that is, chambers of commerce, not that is, e.g., example, chambers of commerce, landlords associations, university senates. Significance: this was a major constitutional advance. It formally acknowledged the principle that a section of the Indian populace had the right to choose their representative, setting a precedent for future expansions of the franchise. The appointment of an Indian to the Viceroy's Executive Council. For the first time, an Indian was appointed to the highest executive body in India. The first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council was S.P. Sinha as the law minister. Significance: this was a powerful symbolic gesture intended to demonstrate that the highest echelons of government were not close to India. It was a concession aimed squarely at the educated professional classes. The core contradiction: separate electorates and the constitutionalization of communalism. The most enduring and damaging provision of the Act was the legal institutionalization of communal electorates. The mechanism: the Act legally established separate electorates for Muslims. This meant that Muslim voters were placed on a separate electoral roll. They could only vote for Muslim candidates in specially reserved constituencies. The justification: the British rationale was to protect the political interest of Muslim minority, ensuring they were not permanently outvoted by Hindu majority. The political reality and impact: institutionalizing division. It legally embedded a religious identity as a primary political identity for Muslims. It transformed Muslims from a religious community into a political constituency defined in opposition to the Hindu constituency, creating a structural incentive for communalism. Politicians now had to appeal exclusively to a religious constituency to get elected. This made communal rhetoric and the highlighting of religious differences a rational political strategy, a master stroke of divide and rule. It successfully divided the nascent nationalist movement along religious lines. It gave the Muslim League, founded in 1906, its foundational political achievement and a compelling reason for its continued existence. A slippery slope. The principle was later extended to other communities, Sikhs, Christian, Anglo-Indians, further fragmenting the body politic and making the development of a unified composite nationalist consciousness immensely more difficult. Source integration. The devastating long-term impact of separate electorates in central theme in Bipin Chandra's India's struggle for independence, which argues it was the most retrograde feature of the Act. Aisha Jalal in the Sole Spokesman Jinnah, the Muslim League and the Demand for Pakistan, analyzes how this constitutional mechanism provided the structural foundation for the later demand for Pakistan. The official British rationale can be traced in the Morley-Minto correspondence and the primary debates on India Councils Act 1909. 4. Assessment and legacy, a dialectical outcome. The Morley-Minto reforms had a deeply dialectical outcome, simultaneously advancing and retarding the Indian political project. From the British colonial perspective, a successful strategy. The reforms were a success. They achieved their primary goals. They successfully split the moderate extremist alliance, with the moderates welcoming the reform as step forward, they drove a permanent wedge between the Hindu and Muslim political elites. They created a loyalist Muslim political constituency. As John Morley himself stated in the House of Lords, if it could be said that this chapter of reforms led directly or necessarily to the establishment of a parliamentary system in India, I, for one, would have nothing at all to do with it. From the nationalist perspective, a poisoned chalice. Positive outcomes. It expanded the arena of political debate and provided a more powerful platform for nationalist critique. It established the irreversible principle of election. Negative outcomes, the poison chalice, the acceptance of separate electorate by the colonial state and the subsequent and controversial acquiescence of the Congress in the Lucknow Pact 1916 legitimized communal politics. It forced the nationalist movement to fight on two fronts, against the British and against the internal division the British had engineered. It set a dangerous constitutional precedent that made all future political settlements contingent on the communal question. The Government of India Act of 1909 was a seminal movement of colonial statecraft. It demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power. Real control could be maintained not just through repression but by structuring the political game itself in a way that fragmented opposition by graniting a limited form of representation while constitutionally hard-coding religious division. The act ensured that Indian politics would be perpetually haunted by the specter of communalism. It did not placate the demand for self-rule, it refrained the demand in a way that would ultimately lead to tragic and violent partition of the subcontinent. The legacy of Morley and Minto is not an enlarged council, but the enduring political fault line they so deliberately and effectively institutionalized. That's it. Topic is completed.